Hello and welcome back to Daddy Rolled a One. I'm Martin. Today we're going to be talking about a role-playing game called Savage Worlds. This is the Adventure Edition, which is the newest edition of the game. The game's been out since 2003 and it's had several different editions during that time. However, all of them are broadly very compatible with each other. There's only minor changes each time. This just happens to be the most recent version of the game. The reason I wanted to make this video right now is because of the recent kerfuffle that's been happening with the OGL. A lot of people in the D&D community, specifically, a lot of them are 5e players. I've been looking for alternatives to D&D given what was going on with the OGL. And what I've seen online is that a lot of those people are beginning to gravitate toward games like Pathfinder or Dungeon Crawl Classics, or I see Castles and Crusades brought up a lot. All those are actually really great games. But at heart, they're really just variations on the D&D game engine. They all use the same 6 ability scores. They're all class and level systems where you roll a D20 against a target number for your degree of success. And so what I wanted to cover here was a game that is not based on the OGL, never was, is not anything like D&D. However, if you are a 5e player, you'll be able to jump right into this. The mechanics are very easy to learn. So if you're familiar with the terminology and the dice and things like that, you'll be able to jump in right away. Before we get started, I would like to say if you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe to my channel. And if you could please share the video on your social media channels, that's the best and fastest way to help me grow my audience and grow my channel. Also, I really like having conversations with people, so please jump into the comments. Let me know what you liked or didn't like about this video. You can ask me questions about Savage Worlds, or you can suggest topics that you'd like to see me cover in the future. Savage Worlds is a 208-page full-color book. It's hardback. You can see they've got the artwork on the inside and the back covers, inside back and inside front covers of this front page artwork, so you can see all the artwork without all the words and stuff on it. Now this is kind of an odd size. You might be able to tell just by holding it in my hand. It's not a standard like 9x12 type size that a typical game rule book would be, like a D&D rule book. However, it's not that smaller. I believe it's called like an A5 size that you see a lot of OSR, old school games using. This is an in-between, so it's bigger than an A5, but it's smaller than a standard book size. The mantra of Savage Worlds is fast, furious fun. And one of the things that this game sets out to do is to be able to adapt and be flexible to any kind of genre that you want to do. That was the rules are designed for this. So you don't have to have separate rules for science fiction versus fantasy versus pulp fiction. All of that is able to be played with this particular rule book. And there's rules for covering all sorts of situations with those in this book. So I have played Savage Worlds. I started playing it probably around, it might have been like around 2006, maybe. It could have been, give or take, with a fantasy game. It was actually a one-on-one game, with just me and a GM. And then very quickly began using it for a Call of Cthulhu game that I was playing in, and that took place in like a 1920s, 1930s pulp era. And I've also played Weird War, or World War II games with a little bit of some arcane stuff going on in there. I've played a Cold War 1950s, 1960s style, Cold War communist spy game. I've played Deadlands, which is a Weird West style of game. And I've come back full circle now and I'm playing fantasy again in a new game. I'm going to talk about that at the end of this. So you can cover all those types of genres with this particular rulebook. You can also cover all these different types of play styles, which we're going to talk about over here, where they mention that you can use this rulebook if you're into very heavy narrative story-based games. You can also use it if you're into games where you want to get out your miniatures and be very tactical, and do everything in between in any level of that you can cover with this particular rule book. So those are some things I think that D&D doesn't necessarily do really well at covering different genres. It's good at fantasy, it's good at heroic fantasy for sure, but it's very hard to play some other types of genres with that rule book without kind of breaking some stuff. So the book jumps into that, and then you get into what you need to get started. So one of the main things that you would need for a Savage Worlds game is a setting. So this book's going to have all the rules, but then every setting, like I talked about, I've played Deadlands, I've played Cthulhu, I've played World War II. All of those have their own setting books, and in those setting books, it will tell you the type of characters that are appropriate for that game, and it'll have any additional rules or modifications to these rules. So while this book does have all the basic rules that you need, typically you would use a setting book for this. However, I will give you sort of a little personal anecdote on that. Years ago, a friend of mine was looking to explore doing an actual play before those were even a thing. This is way before Critical Role was a thing. And he was looking for a system that he wanted to use. And so I ran a game of Savage Worlds for him after only having played it maybe like twice. I jumped in to run the game, and I actually used a campaign setting of my own design that I had been working on for years that was actually designed for the first edition Gamma World game that came out in the late 70s, actually, from TSR, the company that published Dungeons and Dragons. And it's a post-apocalyptic setting. And I had created all of my rules and little things like that for that game system. And I scrapped those mechanics. I kept the setting, and I ran it basically on the fly with almost no work ahead of time to figure out the rules, because the rules didn't change from the basic Savage Worlds rules. I just needed to know what the mechanics were. So speaking of the mechanics, I'm just going to jump into that really quickly. The main mechanic is, in a D20 type game, like a D&D game, is you're rolling a 20-sided die, comparing it to a target number to see if you succeed or not. In Savage Worlds, you tend to use all of your dice more often, with the exception of D20 hardly gets used. But every skill, every attribute, which would be like an ability score in Savage Worlds, and skills like fighting, throwing, even stuff like spell casting, all of those are tied to a specific die type. So either a D4, 6, D8, D10, or D12. And rolling that die, for the most part, this is simplistic because there's some variations on this, but for the most part, you roll a die, and if you get a 4 or higher, you have succeeded. Now, sometimes there's opposed rolls. Sometimes that number isn't 4. Like if you're fighting, your roll is versus your opponent's parry, which is kind of, think of that like an armor class, and that's a static number that might be higher than 4. And so in that case, you have to beat the parry. But in general, in Savage Worlds, you're rolling a die type associated with a specific skill or attribute that you have. And if you get a 4 or higher, you succeed. So I'm going to show you my Savage Worlds dice here. My friend made me this cool dice box. And here are my Savage Worlds dice. And you can see I have 2 D6s, and one of them is a different color, and I'll deal with that in a minute. But let's say, for example, that my repair skill is a D4. So I'm going to roll my D4 here and see what I got. I got a 1, so I failed. Okay. But, let's say that I didn't do that and I rolled a 4. So this time I got a 4. Okay, so that would mean that I actually had succeeded on that task. So now we're getting into 2 kind of fun things with the dice mechanic in Savage Worlds. That 4 meant that I succeeded. However, that 4 is the highest number that you can get on a D4. Savage Worlds does what's called exploding dice. So if you get the highest number on the die that you're rolling, you get to roll that die again and add it to the result. So in this case, I would add 4, and then I rolled again, and I got a 2. So I got a 6. Okay, so that's still just a simple success because I got a 4. However, had I rolled another 4, let's just assume that I rolled a 4 that time instead of a 2, I have an 8. Now, because that die exploded, if I'd rolled a 4, I'd rolled again. This time I got a 3, so I have 8 plus 3 is 11. Now, in Savage Worlds, if you beat your target number by 4, so in this case, a simple success is a 4, but I got an 11. So 4 plus 4 is 8. So I did get an 8. I didn't get to a 12, which would be another degree of success, which is an extra 4. But I did get a success with what's called a raise, because it was a 4 plus 4 for 8. So a success with a raise, that just means whatever I was doing, I did better at. And there's rules in here to deal with that. Sometimes it's open to GM interpretation. But as an example, for spellcasting, say, or fighting, a raise might mean you do more damage. But also for certain spells, it might mean that I doubled my range, or I increased my range. Or if I'm healing, instead of just healing myself, I healed everybody within a certain radius. And it all kind of just depends on how many raises that you get. So that's a fun aspect of the dice mechanic in Savage Worlds. The other one is that every player character in the game gets an extra D6 to roll. They're called wild cards, as are certain NPCs. High-level NPCs are wild cards, and they get to roll an extra D6. So you notice that I had those two different D6s that were different colors, and that's why. So that if I have a D6 and a skill, I'm going to roll a D6 plus my extra D6. But in that case, remember I had a 4. I had a D4 as my skill in repair, as I said. So I would roll the 4 and the 6 together. So in this case, I got a 5 on my D6. I got a 4 on my D4. So I succeeded, but even if this D4 had been a 2, that 5 would have meant that I succeeded. However, in that case, I got a 4, so I would roll again because I exploded. I got a 7. You don't add these together. You only add from a specific die. So I had a 4 plus a 3. I got a 7. So I still only had a simple success. If I'd gotten an 8, I would have had a success and a raise. Okay, that's the mechanic. That's the mechanics of the game. Pretty much everything works on that basis. You are rolling your die that's associated with your skill or attribute. There are 5 different attributes or ability scores. It's like smarts, strength, agility, things like that. There are only 5 of those. They all start out at D4, and as you progress through the game, you get points that you can spend to increase those 1 point per die type. So you can go from a D4 to a D6 in a single attribute, and that will raise that, that will cost you 1 point. So everybody starts out with 5 points. And then also when you start the game, so your concept is going to be, when you're making your characters, your concept is, think of it as like your background or your class, but there's usually not really mechanics tied to it for the most part. That's really coming from your setting. In this game, they use the word race. I assume in the next printing of this, they'll change that to species or something else. But these are your standard, like dwarf, elf, if it's fantasy. But there's a bunch of different races in here. And then hindrances, which is a thing that D&D doesn't really do. D&D doesn't really do flawed characters. Your characters are heroes, or almost like superheroes. And Savage Worlds really leans into this concept of having a hindrance. It's usually not a mechanical hindrance. It's usually a role-playing hindrance, and it just gives you a chance to kind of really get to know your character and give you a hook on playing them. But taking hindrances gives you more points that you can spend to like raise those ability scores like I talked about. You can also spend on things called edges, which are sort of like the equivalent of a feat in 5e. So we talked about that. Also, I just want to show you, just again to cover that, you've got this gothic horror kind of image here, and then here you've got a Roman centurion. They're really showing you that like you can use this game to do anything. So we talked about edges, which are like feats, and then it just gets into like the descriptions. Here's the races. So you can see they're covering androids, Aquarians, and avians, and you know, all the way through like, you know, some different things like celestials, things like that. There's rules for making your own races, which is really fun. Then you've got your list of hindrances here. And then your traits, like your attributes, I said, agility, smarts, spirit, strength, and vigor. Those are your skills. The skills work very similarly to D&D, except for that dice mechanic that I mentioned. And then you've got your edges, like I talked about, and they're kind of broken up into background edges. There's combat, there's leadership edges, there's social, and then my favorite one is the one called... there's professional, called weird edges. Those who know me online know I really like weird stuff in role-playing games. So these are things like Beast Bond or Beastmaster, stuff like that. Then there's a summary of all that stuff. And then you get into your gear. So the gear in here has to cover everything from ancient weapons and armor all through modern, which it does that. There's firearms, but there's also swords, there's space rays, there's vehicles, all that kind of stuff. And then you just get into your rules. We talked a little bit about that before. Initiative works a little bit different in here. It's based on drawing cards, and the fun settings have like their own art on the cards, but you're drawing cards, and if you draw a joker, everybody gets a benefit, and then you reshuffle the deck and start over again. So this just covers all the different rules of the game, which you can see it's not that long, but it is covering everything you need. Fear, hazards, bumps and bruises, what to do with weather and cold, networking, all that kind of stuff is covered in here. And then you get into your powers. So powers is for spellcasters or people like even superheroes, something like that. If you want to use powers, aka spells in this game, you have to take an arcane background. The main rulebook comes with 5: gifted, magic, miracles, psionics, and weird science. And the way that it works is that each one of these is tied to the skill that you would use in order to cast spells. So Miracle's arcane background, which would be like a cleric in D&D terms, uses faith, which is tied to their spirit, as their skill to cast spells. Whereas somebody like with a magic arcane background, this would be like a wizard, uses their spell casting which is tied to smarts. And then weird science uses the weird science skill tied to smarts. So you have to take those skills, put points into them, and then again, you're rolling for that degree of success. Did I get a 4 or higher? So that's really how it works. And then the powers are actually defined kind of, they're very basic. Barrier, there's blast, there's bolt, there's things like that. The way that magic is fun in this game, though, is that the player gets to work with the GM to come up with the trappings of their spell. So it's how that spell manifests. As an example, I had a spellcaster in a game, in a Deadlands game, and I took the power bolt, which is kind of like a magic missile, right? But I was able to define how it manifested, and I said it manifested as little creatures of shadow that came out and sort of these shadowy forms moved through and then attacked the person. So it has no mechanical effect on the spell. The spell still does the same type of damage. It's the same range. It's everything else. But I just decided that's how it looked when people saw it. That's how they experienced it. And that's where you get to have that kind of narrative fun of how you define how things work. The bestiary, again, has to cover every type of thing from, standard animals. There's mules in here, there's dragons, but there's also stuff like mechs and things like that. So it covers the gamut, and there's even rules for making your own. So lastly, there's a small section on game mastering, how to run the game. It's some good advice in here. It's pretty basic, but even covers things like how to put horror into your game and things like that. So that is Savage Worlds in a nutshell. So you can buy this right now. It's available pretty much anywhere that you want to buy a game. And the reason I wanted to cover this is because actually Pathfinder, the folks that make Pathfinder, which is Paizo Publishing, they actually just recently licensed their IP to the folks that make Savage Worlds to make a game called Savage Pathfinder, which is playing the Pathfinder sort of that IP and that look and feel of Pathfinder, but using the rules from Savage Worlds to do it. So I'm going to cover that particular setting book in another video, but I wanted to do this one first just to get the basics of the game down. So look for that video soon. Again, please leave me a comment if you have any questions about the game, and do like and subscribe. Thank you.